The fluorescent lights at Mercy General hummed their mechanical dirge as Katie Morrison arranged suture kits on the trauma bay shelf, each instrument placed with the precision of someone who had once arranged them in a desert compound while mortars walked their way across a FOB. She didn't hum. She didn't make small talk with the other nurses. She moved like a ghost in brown scrubs, her Navy corpsman training buried so deep beneath her civilian identity that no one here knew she'd spent 6 years holding intestines together under fire in Ramadi, holding them together and staying silent, because the Pentagon had been very clear about what staying silent meant. Stay invisible. Stay employed. Stay alive. The instructions came in a manila envelope at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, and delivered by a colonel whose name she was ordered to forget. Senior Chief Morrison died in that compound, the letter said. You are Katie now. Katie Morrison, registered nurse, transferring from a nursing school in Columbus, Ohio that would confirm her employment if anyone bothered to call. Katie Morrison with the 6-year gap explained away as sabbatical. Katie Morrison who flinched at helicopter rotors and composed herself before anyone saw her hands shake. The ER at Mercy General in Denver ran like most trauma centers, controlled chaos, hierarchies measured in credentials, respect distributed like medication according to rank. The attending physicians ruled from their stations. The residents scrambled to prove themselves. The nurses did the work and received the orders. Katie took her place in the system without question, without complaint, her hands moving through 12-hour shifts with the calm efficiency of someone who had once performed emergency tracheostomies in a Humvee rolling through hostile territory. She stocked supplies. She took vitals. She deferred to the residents with practiced courtesy, saying things like, "Of course, doctor, and whatever you think best, doctor," letting her voice stay small and unthreatening. She wore her brown hair pulled tight into a bun. No jewelry. No personal effects in her locker beyond scrubs and a change of shoes. No photos, no mementos, nothing that invited questions. Under her scrubs, sewn into the jacket lining against her ribs like a secret she wasn't allowed to speak, was a faded 1st Marine Division unit patch, the only piece of Ramadi she had kept, the only proof that her old life had been real. Dr. Sterling first noticed her on a Tuesday morning during a multi-vehicle accident on I-25. 3 cars. 8 patients. The kind of chaos that separated the competent from the panicked. Katie was in Trauma Bay 3 with a hypotensive male, 19 years old, multiple fractures, blood loss significant enough that his skin had gone the color of old newspaper. The resident assigned to the trauma, a 3rd year named Morrison, no relation, was running through the protocol with the nervous energy of someone who'd rehearsed the choreography but never danced it in front of an audience that mattered. His hands moved too fast. His voice climbed register. He ordered a 20 gauge for on a patient who needed something wider, something that could push volume faster. Katie stood at the patient's bedside, moving with the eerie calm of someone for whom this was Tuesday, not apocalypse. She was already prepping 2 large bore lines. 18 gauge. The kind that meant business. Before the attending even finished his initial assessment, she had both lines established and was running normal saline through a level 1 rapid infuser, the fluid cascading in like someone had turned on a fire hose inside the vein. Blood pressure climbed. Oxygen saturation held. The patient stabilized while the 3rd year resident was still working through his 2nd for attempt. Dr. Sterling stood in the physician's station and watched this happen. He watched the nurses glance at Katie instead of at the resident giving orders. He watched the attending physician nod at something Katie said about the patient's breath sounds, saw how she'd already identified the pneumothorax before radiology confirmed it. He was 37 years old, 12 years into his career at Mercy General, Chief of Emergency Medicine, a title he'd earned through relentless networking, country club memberships, and the kind of political maneuvering that turned hierarchies into fiefdoms. His voice had a practiced authority that came from never being questioned. His presence filled a room the way a shark fills water. He wore Italian shoes and carried a Rolex that cost more than most nurses made in 3 months, and he had built his entire professional identity on the unchallenged assumption that he was the smartest person in any room where he happened to be standing. Now he watched a nurse in scrubs that had cost $16 at a hospital supplier moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd performed emergency procedures in the kind of conditions that came with artillery coordinates. That night, Katie was in the break room making coffee from the pot that tasted like it had been brewed in 2009 when she heard the helicopter. The sound came first, that distinctive thump-thump-thump of rotor blades cutting air in that particular cadence that meant military. A Black Hawk. She knew the sound like she knew her own heartbeat. Her shoulders tensed for exactly 0.3 seconds. Her right hand moved toward the nearest exit before her conscious mind could catch up, muscle memory computing angles and distances and fallback positions. Then she stopped. Then she breathed. Then she turned back to the coffee maker like nothing had happened, like her nervous system hadn't just run through 3 different combat scenarios in the time it took to pour grounds into a filter. She had been out of Ramadi for 6 years. The helicopters here were not carrying insurgents. The exits led to a suburban Denver parking lot, not to an LZ under fire. By the time Sterling walked past the break room 30 seconds later, she was standing perfectly still, holding a mug of terrible coffee, her hand steady as surgical steel. But Sterling had seen that microsecond. He'd seen her shoulders rise. He'd seen her head turn toward the sound with the precision of someone whose body had been trained to respond to certain frequencies of danger. He'd seen the recovery, the way she controlled her breathing, checked her posture, reset her face back to the neutral expression of a healthcare worker on her break. That sequence of movements was not something you learned in a nursing program in Columbus, Ohio. That was military conditioning. That was something else entirely. Sterling filed it away with the precision of someone who understood that information was leverage, and leverage was power. He made a phone call that afternoon to someone he knew in hospital administration, asking very pointed questions about Katie Morrison's background check, her employment history, the verifiable status of that Columbus nursing school. He made note that her references checked out, barely, and only on a surface level, the kind of verification that suggested either very thorough background work or very thorough fabrication. The next day, Sterling placed a bet. He was sitting in the physician's dining room with 4 of the hospital's attending doctors, men he'd cultivated relationships with over country club tennis matches and weekend golf outings, men who understood that medicine was hierarchical and hierarchy was something worth protecting. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone about to make money. He said Katie Morrison would quit within a week. She was unstable, he said. She'd flinched at a helicopter. She had gaps in her employment history. She was probably using a fake name. Someone that broken would crack under the slightest pressure. He put down $1,000. 3 of them matched it. 1, Dr. Holloway, who'd actually watched Katie perform those 4s on the trauma, looked skeptical but didn't argue. That was how these things worked. The hierarchy protected its own, and Sterling had cultivated enough relationships that he could afford to be reckless. Katie didn't know about the bet. But she knew about Dr. Sterling in the way that people with combat training always know about threats, through the sudden shift in air pressure, the way his eyes tracked her movements, the specific quality of attention that predators directed at prey they were already sizing up. She felt it during her next 12-hour shift when she moved through the trauma bay and he found reasons to be near her, asking questions with the tone of someone testing for cracks. How long have you worked in emergency medicine? Where exactly did you train? That's a very unusual response time for establishing those 4s. Did they teach you some kind of specialized technique? His voice was smooth as oil, and his smile never wavered, but underneath it was something that felt like water circling a drain. She answered his questions with the short, deferential responses she'd been trained to give, the way she'd learned to make herself smaller. Columbus program. Standard training. Just lots of practice. He smiled and nodded and watched her hands to see if they trembled. They didn't. Not anymore. Her hands had learned a long time ago how to stay still when it mattered most. Her hands had learned a long time ago how to stay still when it mattered most. But stillness and invisibility were different things, and Katie Morrison was discovering, during her second week at Mercy General, that one did not guarantee the other. Dr. Sterling found her outside the staff lounge on a Tuesday morning, his voice pitched loud enough to carry down the corridor where 3 residents were passing charts. "Morrison, I've been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, and I've noticed you have opinions about everything from chest tube placement to vasopressor dosing." He leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, smiling like a man who'd already won the conversation. "What nursing school did you say you attended?" Katie met his eyes without flinching. The unit patch pressed against her ribs beneath her scrubs, that faded 1st Marine Division marker sewn into the jacket lining she kept folded in her locker. A reminder. An anchor. Evidence. Ohio State, doctor. Funny. He sipped his coffee slowly. "Because you work like someone who thinks she's running the department. Like you've actually been in charge of something before. Like you're used to giving orders instead of taking them." She didn't answer. The silence stretched like a taut rope between them. One of the residents glanced at Katie with something that might have been sympathy. Another looked away entirely. Sterling pushed off from the doorframe. "You'll get used to the hierarchy here, Morrison. Everyone does eventually. Or they leave." He walked away, the message delivered with precision, not as a question, but as a countdown. 3 days later, during morning rounds, Sterling made his move more public. He stood at the nurse's station where Katie was organizing the day's charts, his voice deliberate and casual as he turned to the 2 attending physicians nearest him. "You know what I think? I think our friend here has military written all over her. Bet you $500 she quits within a week. These types, they can't handle a real hospital where you don't just slap a tourniquet on everything and call it medicine." One attending laughed. The other shifted uncomfortably. Sterling turned to her directly. "What do you think, G.I. Jane? Think you'll last?" Katie's hand stilled on the chart in front of her. She felt the weight of the room, nurses watching, residents pausing mid-conversation, the ambient noise of the ER seeming to recede. Pain was information. Pain told you where the wound was. She took one measured breath, let her eyes meet his for exactly 3 seconds, and said quietly, "I'll do my best, doctor." A single tear escaped as she turned back to her work. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the chart, without flinching, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that came from having spent years in places where showing weakness got people killed. Sterling held the moment for 1 beat, then moved on to rounds. But his jaw had tightened. The tear had done something he hadn't expected. It had made her human in front of witnesses. It had made his cruelty visible. It had made him look worse, not better. The cafeteria happened on a Thursday afternoon. Katie sat alone at a corner table, eating soup that tasted like nothing, her mind already 3 steps ahead to the medication errors she'd caught that morning, things Sterling had missed entirely, things that would have harmed patients if she hadn't been paying attention. She'd said nothing about them. Pointing out a senior physician's mistakes was a faster way to lose a job than forging credentials ever would be. Sterling carried his lunch tray past her table, moving with deliberate casualness. Then, 3 tables away, he executed a stumble that looked authentic until you'd seen enough staged falls to recognize the geometry. His tray pitched forward. His lunch crashed across Katie's table, soup splattering across her scrubs, bread rolls scattering like shrapnel, his coffee mug shattering against the tile floor with a sound like a small explosion. The room went dead silent. Sterling didn't apologize. He stood there for a moment, surveyed the damage with a smirk, then looked directly at her. "Sorry about that, Morrison." The words were apologetic. His face said something else entirely. 2 residents at the next table started laughing, nervous, uncertain laughter, the kind that emerged from an audience unsure if what they'd witnessed was cruelty or accident. Sterling walked away, leaving her alone with soup seeping into her scrubs and the certainty that it had been deliberate. She cleaned it up herself, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd cleaned far worse things in far worse places. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Her composure held like a dam holding back a river. That afternoon, Sterling cornered her in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3. He moved with the precision of a man who'd calculated his moment for 35 p.m. Shift change chaos, maximum witness density, minimal administrative oversight. He held a patient chart in one hand like a prop, and when she turned from restocking the supply cabinet, he didn't hand it to her. He hurled it at her feet. The chart burst open on impact. Medical records scattered across the tile floor like fallen leaves, lab results, imaging reports, progress notes, all spreading in a chaos of white paper and institutional order falling apart. The sound was loud enough that heads turned. The silence that followed was worse. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was polished, almost pleasant. "Your job is documentation, not playing doctor. Let's keep the roles clear, shall we?" Katie crouched slowly. Her movements were precise, deliberate, each one a choice rather than a reaction. She gathered the pages with hands that did not shake, stacking them carefully, reorganizing them into the correct sequence. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, a sound like electricity trapped in tubes, like the constant background hum of institutions. She could feel every eye in the corridor on her back. When she stood, the chart was restored. She held it against her chest. And then she spoke. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but whispers in a silent hallway carry further than shouts in a crowd. "I've held intestines in my hands under mortar fire, Doctor. In Ramadi. While rounds came in from 3 directions and my commanding officer was screaming coordinates into a radio that wasn't working. Your tantrums don't register." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She just stated a fact the way you'd state the time or the temperature, as something immutable and absolute. Sterling's face went red. Actually red, a deep crimson that started at his jawline and climbed toward his temples. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it. 2 nurses were watching from the medication station. A resident stood frozen mid-stride. Whatever he'd been expecting, tears, apologies, submission, he hadn't gotten it. He turned and walked away without another word. But that was the moment Katie understood that she'd made a mistake. Not in what she'd said, that had been controlled, factual, devastating in its precision. The mistake was that she'd let him see what she was. Not everything. But enough. She'd given him a thread, and Dr. Sterling struck her as the kind of man who pulled threads until entire garments unraveled. He was already pulling out his phone before he'd rounded the corner. His walk had changed from the theatrical confidence of a man performing cruelty for an audience to something sharper, more focused. The social bullying had failed. A senior physician at Mercy General didn't get to where Sterling had climbed by using only one approach. He had backup strategies. He had reach. What happened next would be strategic. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Katie could see the calculation in his eyes, the moment when he'd shifted tactics entirely. She'd forced him to his second move, and second moves, in her experience, were always more dangerous than the first. The trauma alert came through at 2:41 p.m., and Katie was restocking the airway cart when the doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in a man in Army PT gear, his left side barely moving with each breath. Training accident at Fort Carson. Tension pneumothorax. The attending had ordered a chest X-ray first, standard protocol, but Katie could read the vital signs before the film even hit the light box. Tachycardia climbing past 120, oxygen sat dropping, the faint asymmetry in his breathing like a song missing its left note. The colonel's jaw was clenched, eyes moving fast, controlled panic of someone used to operating under pressure who knew something was very wrong. She recognized the look. She'd seen it in Ramadi, in the faces of men who understood anatomy well enough to know when their own was betraying them. Katie moved to the bedside without being asked, her hands already reaching for the pulse ox probe, reading the room the way she'd learned to read compound fractures and hemorrhagic shock, not from textbooks but from keeping people alive when the options were surgical precision or watching them die on a concrete floor. The monitor showed his heart working too hard, compensating. His jugular veins were starting to distend slightly, that subtle swelling that most nurses wouldn't catch but that screamed one diagnosis to anyone trained in combat medicine: decreased cardiac filling. Not just a punctured lung. Something worse was coming. "Let's get him to Trauma Bay 3, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty that made 3 residents glance up from their own patients. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact delivered with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The stretcher wheels squeaked against the tile floor as they moved him, and the colonel's eyes tracked her hands as she adjusted his full line, his pupils narrow and tracking like a shooter assessing a target. In the trauma bay, Katie positioned him on his side slightly, decreasing pressure on his right lung, and began her assessment with the precision of someone who'd learned anatomy not in a classroom but in the field. She palpated his trachea with 3 fingers, finding the midline, then counting ribs with a touch that could have been a caress if it hadn't been so brutally clinical. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands moved like they were reading Braille, finding the landmarks that would tell her everything. The colonel watched her hands move across his chest, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Not the casual interest of a patient observing treatment, but the specific, dangerous awareness of someone who'd been trained to identify military personnel by their technique. His breathing was becoming more labored, his color starting to pale, and Katie knew the timeline was collapsing. Needle decompression. Now. "I'm going to relieve the pressure," she told him, and her voice had dropped half an octave. Not asking permission. Informing him of the sequence of events that would keep him breathing. She pulled a 14-gauge needle from the code cart, her movements economical and precise, each motion exactly where it needed to be with no hesitation or revision. The needle felt familiar in her hand, the same weight as a dozen other needles she'd used in compounds and field hospitals, advancing through skin and into thoracic cavities while rounds snapped overhead and men screamed on gurneys. The colonel's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was strong but not aggressive, the grip of someone holding a question that needed answering before it was too late. His eyes locked on hers with the intensity of a man whose brain was being starved of oxygen and whose instincts were screaming at him that this woman's hands moved with a precision that didn't belong in a civilian emergency room. His voice came out as barely a whisper, each word clipped and careful. "Your Fleet Marine Force qualified. I watched FMF corpsmen work in Ramadi exactly like this." The air in the trauma bay seemed to pressure lock around them. Katie could feel the moment crystallizing, the dangerous recognition hanging between them like a held breath before the drop. His grip on her wrist wasn't a restraint, it was an anchor. A silent message that he understood what she was, who she'd been, and that he was about to trust her with his life based not on any credential hanging on a wall but on the way her hands moved. Katie didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Her eyes held his with the same flat composure she'd learned to maintain in operating theaters lit by battery-powered work lamps while sandstorms rattled the perimeter. "Let go," she said, and the words carried the weight of someone who'd given orders to men who would follow them into fire. Not aggressive. Not pleading. Just a fact, stated with the certainty of someone used to being obeyed. He released her wrist. Katie advanced the needle at the precise 45-degree angle, the tip sliding through skin and fascia with the slight resistance of tissue parting, and she felt the syringe chamber adjust as the pressure changed, as the trapped air hissed free with a sound like breath escaping. The monitor beside them registered the change immediately, the oxygen saturation climbing, the heart rate beginning to stabilize, his color returning to something approaching normal. 78. 82. 84. "Better?" she asked, withdrawing the needle slightly, the syringe still at the site in case she needed to advance it again. She wasn't speaking to him. She was speaking to the vital signs, to the physiology, to the mathematics of keeping a human body functioning when the systems that should support it had begun to fail. The colonel's breathing had deepened, and his eyes were clearer now, the oxygen returning to his brain, his blood pressure stabilizing like a system finding its equilibrium. "Yeah," he breathed, his eyes still tracking hers with that same dangerous recognition. "Yeah. That's better." The tension in the bay eased fractionally as the monitors showed improvement, and Katie was already thinking 3 steps ahead, echocardiogram to rule out pericardial effusion, chest X-ray to confirm lung re-expansion, labs to assess for infection or secondary pneumothorax. But the colonel's hand found her wrist again, gentler this time, not grabbing but holding. His voice was still barely audible, meant only for her, "Ramadi. What unit? Katie withdrew the syringe fully, her movements controlled and complete. She didn't answer him. Couldn't. The rules she'd been given were absolute and uncomplicated. She was dead. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had been erased from existence at 0300 hours on a date that didn't exist anymore, in a compound that was now classified beyond top secret, under orders that had come through channels so dark that even the men who gave them wouldn't speak her name aloud again. A midnight exfiltration had ended with her commanding officer's voice in her ear. Senior Chief Morrison died in that compound. You understand? Dead. No one knows you exist. She taped down the 4-line without responding to the question, her expression unreadable, and that's when Dr. Sterling appeared in the trauma bay doorway. His face shifted through a series of micro-expressions, initial surprise at seeing Katie at the bedside, then the recognition that she was doing something, then the slow crystallization of fury as he understood what had just happened. His eyes moved from the colonel to the monitor to Katie's hands, and she could see the calculation happening in real time. A procedure. Unauthorized. Performed by a nurse. Without attending physician approval. Who performed needle decompression? Sterling's voice was controlled but edged with something sharp as a scalpel. He wasn't asking Katie. He was asking the room, asking everyone who'd witnessed this moment to confirm what he was seeing: insubordination, protocol violation, a nursing assistant operating far outside her lane. Katie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was already turning away from the bedside, already documenting the time, the vital signs before and after, the clinical indication for the procedure. Her composure was absolute and complete. She'd been in rooms before where her authority to act had been questioned by men with more rank and less sense, and she'd learned long ago that defending your actions was often the first sign that you doubted them. Pressure was 80/40, she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough clinical detachment to sound like she was reading from a textbook. Tracheal deviation wasn't present, but the asymmetrical breathing and hypertension indicated pneumothorax with hemodynamic compromise. Needle decompression is indicated before imaging. Cardiothoracic wasn't available immediately. I didn't ask you to interpret the clinical picture, Sterling said, his tone shifting into something colder, something that sounded like the beginning of the end. I asked who performed the procedure. Katie met his eyes then, and something in her expression changed, not noticeably, not in any way that would constitute insubordination, but in the subtle registers of someone who'd made a decision and was no longer willing to apologize for it. I did, Doctor. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Just long enough for everyone in the trauma bay to understand that something significant had shifted. The colonel's hand was still on Katie's wrist, his eyes moving from her to Sterling with the intelligence of someone who understood hierarchies and rank and the specific type of institutional power that could destroy a person's career if wielded correctly. Sterling's face had gone very still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Mercy General E.R., Sterling said very quietly, his voice like ice settling over water. You will not perform procedures above your scope again. Do you understand me? Katie didn't respond. Her silence was its own answer, not defiance, but something more dangerous, the refusal to engage with his authority as if it were legitimate. She was already turning back to the monitor, already beginning the secondary assessment, already preparing for the next crisis. The colonel was breathing easier, and that was what mattered. Everything else, Sterling's fury, the protocol violation, the risk to her own employment, was secondary mathematics. But Sterling wasn't finished. He stepped into the trauma bay fully, his presence bringing the air pressure change of a predator entering its territory, and he raised his voice so that the entire ER could hear it. You're suspended from all patient care effective immediately pending an internal investigation. Get out of my trauma bay. The words landed like a dropped instrument tray, sharp and final and irrevocable. Katie's hand stilled for just a moment, the faintest hitch in her breathing, before she began pulling off her gloves with controlled precision. She'd known this was coming. She'd made the choice eyes open. As she turned to leave the trauma bay, the colonel squeezed her wrist one final time, and his voice came low and clear, "Thank you, Senior Chief." Katie didn't respond. She couldn't. But as she walked past Sterling toward the doors, her spine was straight and her head was level, and the eyes of every doctor, nurse, and resident in the emergency department were tracking her with a specific intensity of people who'd just watched someone choose between following rules and saving a life. She'd chosen to save a life. And in 3 days, that choice would bring the Pentagon to her door. The monitor's alarm pierced the trauma bay like a scream nobody could ignore. 2 hours and 17 minutes after Katie's needle had released the pressurized air from the colonel's chest, his oxygen saturation climbing steady and true, his vitals had stabilized into something resembling normal. She'd stepped back, peeled off her gloves, let the resident take over post-procedure charting. The colonel's eyes had found hers across the bay, a flash of recognition, of gratitude, the kind of look that passes between soldiers who've stood in the same fire. She couldn't acknowledge it. Professional distance. Cover maintained. She turned toward the supply cart when the cardiac monitor went from steady beeping to a rapid staccato that made every trained ear in the room snap toward the bed. Muffled heart sounds. The monitor showed a rate of 142, climbing. Oxygen dropping. The resident was frozen, staring at the screen as if the numbers might change if he looked hard enough. Katie moved before conscious thought. Tension pneumothorax resolved, but something else was compressing the heart, blood collecting in the pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the cardiac muscle filling like a balloon, squeezing the ventricles until they couldn't contract. Cardiac tamponade. The second killer. The one that came after you'd already survived the first. Dr. Sterling's voice erupted from the far end of the bay like a siren. Cardiothoracic. I need cardiothoracic down here now. Etta. His phone was already at his ear, his free hand gesturing with the arrogance of a man who believed his rank could rewrite anatomy. But cardiothoracic was 42 floors up in the surgical tower. In a proper hospital with a proper chain of command, they'd be en route in minutes. They wouldn't arrive in time. The colonel's blood pressure was sliding, 110/65, dropping toward shock, toward the irreversible moment when a heart stopped because nothing inside the chest cavity could move. The fluid was suffocating him from the inside out. Katie moved to the bedside. Hand me an 18-gauge spinal needle and a 35-milliliter syringe. Sterling's head snapped toward her. Stand down. You're not cleared for. His heart's in tamponade. Her voice was flat. Statement of fact. The kind of voice that doesn't ask for permission because there is no time for permission. Pericardiocentesis. Now. The resident's hands were already moving, muscle memory from simulation and procedure labs overriding the paralysis of doubt. The needle was in her hand before Sterling could finish whatever command was forming in his throat. Katie didn't look at him. She didn't look at anything except the space between ribs 5 and 6, the intercostal space where she'd done this before, not on a trauma dummy, not in a controlled educational setting, but under the concussive percussion of distant mortars in a casualty collection point outside Ramadi, hand steady despite the tremor of the building around her, doing this same procedure while a corporal screamed and blood soaked through bandages faster than the corpsman could replace them. Pain is data. Hands moved. The needle sank through skin, through fascia, through muscle, angled toward the xiphoid process, the landmark beneath the breastbone. The fluid met the needle's bevel with the sensation of pressure releasing, like opening a door on an overfilled room. Katie drew the plunger back, and blood filled the syringe chamber. Dark, venous blood, 50 cubic centimeters, then 60, each milliliter pulled back like releasing pressure from a building about to collapse. The monitor's rhythm began to change. 30 ccs drawn. The QRS complexes on the monitor became sharper, taller. 50 ccs. The rate dropped from 142 to 118. 60 ccs and the oxygen saturation climbed, 85, 88, 91, 95. Sinus rhythm returned. The straightforward, life-giving march of a normal heartbeat, a heart that could finally contract without the weight of blood crushing it from the outside. Katie withdrew the needle. Pressure dressing. Tape. The colonel's breathing deepened. His eyes, which had been locked in a 1,000-yard stare of hypoxia, refocused. Color returned to his face like someone turning up the lights. The resident stared at the monitor as if witnessing a miracle, which, in the calculus of emergency medicine, he was. Sterling's phone was at his ear before Katie finished securing the dressing. His voice cut across the bay, sharp enough to draw every head. "Jim, it's Marcus Sterling. I need the board president's direct line." "Yes, I know it's Saturday. This is urgent. We have a liability situation that requires immediate action." Katie didn't look at him. She stripped off her gloves, the sound of latex against skin like the cocking of a weapon, and walked toward the supply cart. 24 hours ago, Sterling had been a man trying to break her with casual humiliation. Now she'd just saved the life of a Delta Force colonel while operating in a gray area that technically existed outside her scope of practice. He would see that differently. He would see threat. He would see liability. He would see proof that she wasn't who her employment file claimed to be. By the time she disposed of the needle and syringes in the biohazard container, Sterling was on his third call. She caught fragments, discrepancies in her employment file. Previous nursing school contact. External investigator to audit her credentials. His voice carried the cadence of a man executing a plan that had been forming in his mind for weeks, waiting only for the moment she stepped outside the box he'd drawn for her. 3 hours and 47 minutes later, Katie was standing in the hospital administrator's office on the 14th floor, fluorescent light falling harsh and clinical across her face. The administrator sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than Katie's annual salary. To her left, a man in a charcoal suit from the hospital's legal department. Sterling stood near the window, the afternoon sun behind him turning him into a silhouette, the villain always backlit, always removed from direct scrutiny. "Ms. Morrison," the administrator began, and Katie noted the emphasis on the false last name, the one that existed nowhere except in forged documents that had been good enough to pass human resources but not, apparently, an external audit. "We've discovered some inconsistencies in your employment paperwork." The investigator slid a folder across the desk. Katie didn't open it. She didn't need to. She already knew what was inside: a nursing degree from Cleveland Medical College dated 2017, registered with the Ohio Board of Nursing, but with enrollment records that showed a gap of 3 months in the timeline. A social security number attached to nothing before 6 years ago. A history of employment that simply didn't exist in the databases that auditors checked. "Your references at the nursing school don't match employment records," the investigator continued. "When we contacted the registrar, there was some confusion about your graduation date. Can you explain the discrepancies?" Katie's hands were steady. Her breathing was even. The tremor that threatened to split through her chest, not fear, not quite. Restraint. The compressed energy of someone who knows exactly how bad this is and has trained long enough to keep it behind her eyes. She couldn't defend herself. That was the architecture of her exile. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had died in a compound in Ramadi, in a room whose operational status she would take to her grave or into a Pentagon basement, whichever came first. Her commanding officer had made that clear during the midnight exfiltration, his voice low and official. "You understand? You died in that compound. The operation is classified at levels above my access. If you surface, if anyone knows you survived, you don't get to go home. You go to a debriefing facility and you answer questions about missions that never happened, operations that don't exist in any file anywhere. You disappeared, and that's the only way you stay alive and the team stay intact." So she had disappeared. She had become Katie Morrison, a nurse from Ohio with a fabricated history and forged credentials and a faded unit patch sewn into the lining of the jacket hanging in her apartment closet, the only thing from Ramadi she'd managed to keep. She could not explain any of this. "I don't dispute the records," Katie said quietly. "They're accurate." Sterling's expression shifted, a microsecond of surprise that she wasn't fighting back, followed immediately by satisfaction, the kind of look a chess player wore when the opponent moved into a trap they'd already prepared. "That's an admission," the legal counsel said. His pen moved across a document. "I'll need this documented for the record." You're confirming that your employment application contained false information. Yes. One word. The nail. The coffin. The door closing. The administrator's face had gone pale. Sterling watched from his silhouette, watching her understand that she'd been outmaneuvered not through physical intimidation or public humiliation, but through systematic, methodical assassination of the cover that was her only lifeline. He turned her hidden identity into her destruction. He'd weaponized the fact that she couldn't explain what she really was. "We have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately," the administrator said. Her hands were shaking slightly as she slid a document across the desk. "You'll be contacted by legal counsel regarding the falsification of employment records. The hospital will be notifying the State Board and the Colorado Nursing Commission. There may be criminal charges." Katie's vision had narrowed to the edges of her peripheral sight, but her hands remained still. Her breathing remained steady. She was looking at the wall behind the administrator, at a framed certificate from some hospital administration program, at credentials that meant exactly nothing compared to 16 months in Ramadi learning how to keep people alive when everything was designed to kill them. "Clean out your locker before 5 p.m. Security will escort you from the building." Sterling's voice was almost gentle, the gentleness of complete victory. "I'm sorry it had to end this way, Katie. Clearly you're struggling with some kind of identity crisis. I hope you get the help you need." She stood. The chair scraped against tile. She walked to the door without looking back, without acknowledging that Sterling had just destroyed the one structure that had been holding her to the ground. The walk to the break room locker was a grey blur of corridor and fluorescent light. She had 2 hours before security would start making calls, before her badged access would be revoked, before the door she'd been using to maintain civilian cover slammed shut forever. She packed what existed of a personal life at Mercy General, a coffee mug from the hospital gift shop, a phone charger, the small things that accumulate when you're trying to look like someone normal. The jacket with the faded unit patch was still hanging in the back, beneath a spare pair of scrubs she'd forgotten to clean out. She was zipping the duffel bag when voices echoed down the corridor, wheels on tile, the stretcher sounds from patient transport. The Delta Force colonel was being transferred out of trauma ICU to a step-down unit, no longer critical, no longer in need of emergency interventions. She heard his voice, low and strong, thanking a nurse. She didn't let herself look as the stretcher passed the doorway. She couldn't acknowledge what had happened in that trauma bay. She couldn't admit that his eyes had met hers or that she'd recognized him or that any of it mattered. By 5:15 p.m., Katie Morrison's employment at Mercy General had been officially terminated, her name removed from the scheduling system, her access badge deactivated. She walked out through the ER bay doors into the Denver evening, where the rain was falling hard enough to sound like applause, and she drove home to an apartment where nobody knew who she actually was, because by every official record that mattered, she didn't exist anymore. 3 days passed. 3 days. That's how long Katie Morrison sat in the VA hospital waiting room in Denver, staring at hands that had held intestines under mortar fire and now couldn't hold a pen steady enough to fill out the mental health intake form. The fluorescent lights above her cast everything in shades of institutional gray, the vinyl chairs, the faded pamphlets about PTSD, the faces of other veterans who recognized something broken in her posture and looked away out of respect. She'd been erased from one world and expelled from another. Mercy General had terminated her employment for falsified credentials. The hospital administrator's voice on the phone had been apologetic but firm. "Your nursing school in Ohio doesn't exist. Your references were fabricated." Dr. Sterling's investigation was thorough. What he didn't say, what Katie understood completely, was that she couldn't fight back without revealing the classified operation in Ramadi, without explaining the midnight exfiltration, without saying the name of the commanding officer who'd told her, Senior Chief Morrison died in that compound, you understand. To defend herself would be to expose the Pentagon's erasure order, to drag the entire classified operation into the light. Sterling had moved with surgical precision. The external investigator he'd hired had found the discrepancies in her employment documents within 18 hours. The hospital board, protective of its reputation and liability, hadn't waited for her explanation. They terminated her with a letter stating she could face criminal prosecution for falsified employment documents, and Katie had signed the separation agreement without protest because protesting would have required testimony she wasn't permitted to give. Now she sat in the VA waiting room, surrounded by veterans she'd once treated in field hospitals, men whose names she remembered, whose wounds she'd dressed when blood loss was measured in seconds, whose lives she'd held in her hands. One of them recognized her. A ranger with a prosthetic right leg, a scar that split his face from temple to jaw. Senior Chief. He'd said her rank like it was a question, like he wasn't sure she was real anymore. Katie had nodded. Didn't correct him. Didn't tell him she wasn't a senior chief anymore, not officially, not in any document that mattered. The rank was sewn into her bones. It didn't vanish because a hospital administrator sent a termination letter. She was filling out the form, a name, date of birth, reason for visit, when the sound came. It wasn't subtle. It was the distinctive heavy thump-thump-thump of rotors that made every veteran in the waiting room go rigid. Two of them, the sound overlapping, getting louder. UH-60M Blackhawks. Not one. Two. Landing on the VA hospital roof. The waiting room collectively held its breath. Katie's hand stilled on the form. The ranger with the prosthetic leg leaned forward. That's tactical. That's not medical transport. His voice had that particular edge that came from recognition, the sound of extraction, of things that happened outside normal protocol, of decisions made at levels that didn't explain themselves to enlisted personnel. The elevator at the far end of the waiting room opened. Out stepped a full-bird colonel in dress uniform, his uniform crisp enough to crack, his bearing the kind that made the air pressure change. Behind him came Pentagon security, two men in suits with the particular blend of awareness and readiness that meant they'd trained to protect important people in hostile environments. The colonel walked directly to the front desk, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the waiting room like a knife through water. "Where is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison?" The receptionist's face went pale. Every veteran in the room turned to look at Katie. She stood slowly. Didn't rush. Composure had been trained into her bones in places with names she couldn't say. The colonel's eyes found her, confirmed something in his expression, a slight nod. Then the elevator doors opened again. The Delta Force colonel she'd saved in the ER at Mercy General stepped out. Fully recovered. Moving with precision that spoke of healing completed, of second chances that field medicine had made possible. And beside him walked a Navy SEAL commander, tall, lean, with the kind of dangerous calm that came from having already survived the worst. The SEAL commander moved straight to Katie. "Senior Chief, we need you to come with us." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the respect that came from someone who understood exactly what she'd endured. "What's happening?" The receptionist's voice was small, confused. Katie didn't answer. She grabbed the jacket she'd draped over the vinyl chair, the one with the unit patch sewn into the lining, hidden, the only piece of Ramadi she'd kept through everything. As she turned to follow the colonel and the SEAL commander toward the elevator, the doors burst open again. FBI agents. 3 of them, moving with a focused intensity that meant they had a target and they'd already confirmed the location. The lead agent, older, with gray at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd been doing this for 20 years, walked past Katie and the military officers directly toward the waiting room entrance. "Where's Dr. Marcus Sterling?" the agent asked the receptionist. The receptionist pointed toward the hallway that connected to the ER. The agent nodded to his team. They moved without haste, without panic, with the kind of purpose that suggested they'd already done all the questioning they needed to do. Katie watched them go, understanding what had happened, how it had happened. The external investigator Sterling had hired to find her fabricated credentials had found something else instead. Something Sterling had never intended to expose. The full-bird colonel put a hand on Katie's shoulder. "Come with us, Senior Chief." The SEAL commander didn't move. His eyes tracked the FBI agents moving down the hallway. "They're taking him now," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. He was confirming something he'd already been briefed on. Katie followed them into the elevator, toward the roof, toward the Blackhawks, and in the moment before the doors closed, she heard it. Boots on tile. Multiple people moving. The sound of a man's voice protesting, confused, then desperate as reality collided with whatever he believed about his own invulnerability. The elevator climbed. The rotor noise grew louder. The SEAL commander pulled a folder from inside his dress uniform jacket and handed it to Katie. "Your actual service record," he said. "They kept it sealed while you were in civilian placement. That ended 3 days ago." Katie opened the folder. The first page listed her decorations. Navy Cross. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Then the second medal listed, another Bronze Star with Valor. Another Navy Cross. The medals stacked like evidence of wars nobody talked about, of operations that officially never happened. 3 Navy Crosses, the SEAL commander said quietly. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Purple Heart. You're one of 7 women to serve embedded with SEAL teams in denied areas. You conducted 847 medical interventions. 763 of them in combat zones. You saved the life of a Delta Force colonel 3 days ago using a technique trained exclusively in FMF corpsman qualification. That means the only person who could have performed a pericardiocentesis in a civilian ER with precision calibrated to tactical field medicine standards was someone whose entire identity had been erased. The elevator doors opened onto the roof. The wind from the rotor wash pressed against them like a physical force. The pilot of the first Black Hawk had the engines at idle, waiting. Katie walked toward it, the folder still in her hands, the unit patch still hidden in the lining of her jacket, still not yet ready to be seen in daylight. Inside the aircraft, she could see monitors, communication equipment, the kind of infrastructure that existed for briefings and operations. The full-bird colonel gestured her toward the cabin. As she moved, she heard the sound, radio static crackling, then a voice, clear and precise, Secretary of Defense standing by. Back at Mercy General, in the ER hallway, Dr. Sterling had tried to explain himself to the FBI agents. "I'm a decorated physician with 15 years of service. I reported credential fraud as a matter of institutional protocol. I was protecting patient safety." The lead FBI agent cut him off. The agent's voice was steady, professional, the tone of someone who'd made this speech many times before. "The investigator you hired noticed something interesting, Dr. Sterling. Recent access to Katie Morrison's personnel file from your hospital login. Timestamps altered on documentation related to the Delta Force colonel's cardiac tamponade code. When we looked deeper, we found falsification of medical records in 4 additional cases where your treatment decisions resulted in patient complications. In each case, you altered the records to shift blame and protect your reputation." Sterling's face had gone white. "That's insane. Those are routine quality improvements." The agent produced handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." As they walked him toward the exit, every ER staff member had gathered in the hallway. The residents who'd laughed when Sterling knocked Katie's cafeteria tray to the floor. The nurses who'd heard him hiss "Pick that up, sweetheart," and watched her not flinch. The charge nurse who'd seen him block Katie from accessing the supply cabinet during the Delta Force colonel's code. The hospital administrator who'd authorized the termination. Sterling's expensive watch, a $12,000 Omega Seamaster, caught the fluorescent light as the agent secured his hands behind his back. His voice had become small, confused. "I don't understand." "I identified the fraud. I protected the hospital." A resident whispered to the colleague beside him. He made her pick up charts. Called her G.I. Jane. She had 3 Navy Crosses the entire time. The charge nurse spoke quietly, to no one in particular. He was willing to let a patient die to protect his authority. They walked Sterling out through the ER bay doors, and nobody moved to stop them. Nobody spoke. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was recognition. It was the sound of people understanding that they'd been standing next to a legend and calling her just a nurse. 6 weeks later, Katie Morrison stood on the Pentagon steps in her dress uniform. Senior Chief Petty Officer, her service record unsealed, her decorations no longer theoretical. The Secretary of Defense stood beside her, holding something small and faded, the 1st Marine Division unit patch that had been sewn into her jacket lining since Ramadi. "This belongs with the rest of your legacy now," the Secretary said, pinning it to her uniform beside her Navy Cross ribbons. 3 Navy Crosses. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Purple Heart. The medals organized in ascending order of prestige, each one a separate statement of what she'd survived and what she'd given. The Secretary offered her a position. Special Operations Medical Training Center. Training the next generation of combat medics. Teaching the techniques that saved lives in Ramadi, the techniques that had brought a Delta Force colonel back from the edge of cardiac arrest in a civilian ER. Katie accepted. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "When do I start?" Meanwhile, Dr. Marcus Sterling taught CPR at a community college in a suburb of Denver for $18 an hour. His medical license had been revoked. His network of board members and attending physicians had evaporated the moment federal charges were filed. The residents who'd bet on Katie quitting within a week now told their own students about the nurse who'd performed a pericardiocentesis under pressure, who'd held her composure through public humiliation, who'd turned out to be one of the most decorated combat medics in classified service history. On Katie's first day at the training center, the Delta Force colonel she'd saved attended the morning briefing. He was fully recovered, moving without pain, standing without the careful positioning that indicated lingering injury. He stood in front of a classroom of special operations medics, many of them young women who reminded Katie of herself before Ramadi, and described the 3-finger tracheal palpation technique he recognized in a civilian ER. How he knew immediately that only an FMF-qualified corpsman could execute it with that precision. How that recognition had changed everything. Katie addressed her first class. Her voice had changed. It no longer carried the deferential tone of civilian life. It carried the weight of command earned through survival. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior," she said. "You need steady hands. A strong spine. The courage to do what's right when someone with more authority is telling you to stand down." The faded unit patch sat on her desk beside her Navy Crosses, no longer hidden, no longer sewn into a lining like a secret that could destroy her. Just a piece of cloth. Just proof that the quietest person in the room might be holding everything together. If you made it this far, you've just witnessed what happens when the wrong person meets the right person at exactly the moment everything changes. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and perfect justice. Like this video if you'd have done exactly what Katie did. And comment, have you ever been massively underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value? This channel runs on your engagement.